Hey there. I'm going to be talking today about measuring the deltas, using a thing called the Null Test to be able to understand what a piece of audio gear may actually be doing to our sound. So I'm Craig Stark, and I want to point out, I brought up this old picture here from 1973. I'm not the Craig Stark. A number of years ago, I was very active in astrophotography. I wrote software for it, PhD guiding and nebulosity and stuff like that. And I would be approached sometimes by folks asking, hey, are you the Craig Stark? And I would say, no, I know who you're talking about. You're talking about this guy here, my dad. So this is my dad with other folks from Stereo Review magazine back in 1973. And I love this. It's called the 10 Golden Ears. Let you count them up there for a second. And what they were doing is they were taking part in a listening test engineered by this guy, Bob Carver. And what Carver was doing is he was trying to see how much distortion can we actually have in our amplifiers before this gets to actually be audible. So you have Julian Hirsch, Larry Klein, Ralph Hodges, and my dad there, and my dog Plato. So this is not me, but this was where I lived at the time in New York, and this was then the 6-foot test rack's worth of gear that I grew up with, and so for the decades that followed, I was really a part of this, doing listening tests and measurements with him. I will, by the way, note in all of this just how high the distortion had to be. But I'm getting out of my lane here. I'm talking about measuring the deltas, and why did I bring this up? I brought this up because of Bob Carver. So Bob Carver had this classic test that he did in the 80s called the Carver Challenge. And the way this worked, he challenged audiophile magazines to say, hey, look, I think I can make my amplifier sound like anything that you could throw at me. And in 1985, Stereophile took him up on the challenge. And what he was saying was he thought that he could engineer his amplifier to have the same transfer function. So taking the input signal coming out of the preamp into the output being fed into the speakers, that transfer function, he thought that he could have his amplifier match whatever they threw at him. And so Stereophile challenged him. They gave him a pair of Conrad Johnson monoblocks. Each one was $3,000, so we're talking $6K worth of gear here. And they said, all right, look, put your money where your mouth is. These are the speakers we're going to use. Now go and do this. And so he set up in a hotel room with some test gear and the Conrad Johnson's amps and his amp, and he then decided to set up a null test. This was his plan all along. And in the test here, what it does is it takes a different signal. So he would feed the signal into both amplifiers, have either a realistic speaker, an actual speaker, or a complex load on it, and then he would set his gear up to measure the difference between the two. You can even just do this with an oscilloscope. And he would also then set up so he could listen to that difference and see really what's going on, and then keep adjusting his amplifier until that difference was nulled out, which is why it's called the null test. And in the end, he passed. None of the folks from Stereophile could actually reliably tell the difference between the $6,000 Conrad Johnson's and his $625 amp that became the M1.0T, T being for transfer function modified. Sound kind of familiar to today? This is 40 years ago. They're having debates as to whether, differences between amps are audible, and later on, of course, it turns into DACs and cables and all sorts of things here. So this is a brutal test because it's going to isolate any amount of difference that's actually there in the signal. Not necessarily what you can hear, but anything that's in the signal. And it was kind of fun that when my dad got one of the Carver amps that actually didn't have this T-mod, Bob said, come on, Craig, give me the amplifier, and took it back to his place and actually then put in all the circuitry to do the mods and also gave us a little switch that we could flip between the two. So, but just as an idea, if you don't sort of get this concept of the nulling, what we have on the top here, here's an audio waveform. This is me actually just saying the word boo. All right, nothing special about saying boo. But now then we say, okay, look, let's take this and let's invert the phase. Let's flip these. So as you see here, as this goes up, we have down here this one going down. Okay, so we can then take them and sum them up. And since all I've done here is I've flipped the phase on this so that I could look at the difference between them by adding these two, inverting the second one and adding them, I'm trying to actually see what's the difference between them. Okay, so this is a perfect null because the only thing I had actually done there was flipping the phase. If instead we do something like we take the input, we flip the phase, and we add a little tiny notch filter. So I put a notch filter at 1 kilohertz with a fairly tight Q of 3, and now you can see, oh, wait a minute, no, there is a nice difference that's come up there. So these things now do not null because there's a difference actually in the signal, something has gone on, and so when you put them together, you don't get that null. Okay, so it's a brutal, brutal test. Anything that comes through here, you may or may not be able to hear, but if nothing comes through, if there is no difference in the signal, well, you can't hear anything there. Zero signal out means nothing that's going to be getting to our speakers. It is the same exact thing, or our headphones. Okay, so I told him my dad was a editor at Stereo Review magazine. He's telling me now, Craig, it's like, please stop bearing the lead here. Let me give you an idea then as to what we're talking about. So what I've got here is the original sound. Let's take a listen to the original music. This is some music. It happens to be from Jethro Tull, The Poet and the Painter. This is being used under fair use, blah, blah, blah on the bottom. Here's the original. As the sun plays on the infantry, returning from the sea, the door and the okay. So I picked this music very, very intentionally. I picked this music. Yeah, I've been listening to Jethro Tull for way too long, but there's a doubling that goes on in here. And in that doubling, what's happening is there's a phase difference between the left and the right channel to get it so that you're hearing these two simultaneously over here. And I happen to know that in this exact section of this exact music, that I can actually tell the difference between Bluetooth and direct connection here. And I'll go into that a little bit later. So, okay. We take this kind of track here and we now say, all right, now let's go and actually take two independent recordings of this, having gone through a DAC that's being fed by USB, do a null test on this, line them up perfectly, do the subtraction, and I'll go into the methods on this later, and here's what you get. Yeah, there's absolutely nothing. You shouldn't be hearing anything at all. However, if instead what we do is we say, now let's have it go through Bluetooth, and this happens to be from my iPhone by its AAC to a topping DX5, blah, 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 details later, here's what you get. Ooh, there's a little bit of something there. Okay, can't hear it all that well. Let's boost it up a little bit here by 15 dB. Ooh, there is something kind of scratchy, kind of grainy, kind of something, but there's a difference. All right, so as a quick little bonus track, here's what happens instead if you use Apple's Airplay. Oh, little something, not a whole heck of a lot, but a little bit of something. Now let's do actually boost that up 15 dB. Okay, a tiny bit. All right, so in all of this here, we can use the null test to identify exactly what's going on. And we can then see, all right, what's left over there. Now, mind you, by the way, I do quickly want to point out, if we go back to this original, okay, that's pretty, we've set it to a reasonable volume. Here's the difference. That's going to be buried pretty far down. So you may or may not be able to hear that because it's buried pretty far down. Certainly this one here. I mean, seriously? You think you're hearing this when on top of it you have this? As the sun plays on the infantry, yeah, no, you're not hearing any of that. It's buried way deep inside there. All right. That's what we're going to be talking about today. How I'm going to be doing this is, how I did this, I should say, is to use some software called DeltaWave by Paul K. Here's the website, there's the software, absolutely fantastic, because what it does, you can take a couple of audio files, digital audio files, pipe them in, it automatically matches the levels, it corrects the phase to about 1,000th of a sample, it measures and corrects any clock drift, it computes the difference, it lets you visualize this in all sorts of ways, and also saves the matched files, and that's in fact what I was playing for you just before. Fantastic software. So we can do something like, first, step one, I'm a scientist, I want to go and find some track in which I actually know that there is an audible difference. I was listening through my Topping DX5 Mark II, using Apple Music, playing to the iPhone here, and I said, all right, look, let's feed it either by USB-C or by Bluetooth. Then I went and matched the levels. Again, I'm an actual scientist and all this kind of thing here, and so of course I'm whipping out meters and testing things. Anyway, so play in a 1 kilohertz tone, and out of the two of these, set the volume such that I have as close a match as I possibly can. Then I went through and actually did a sighted test, trying to find some bits of music in which I thought I could reliably tell the difference. I picked 2 different tracks in which I could, Ride Across the River by Dire Straits and The Poet and the Painter, which you were just listening to, by Jethro Tull. And then after I did that, and I was noticing here in tons of it, you really can't. But at other times, I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Here's this cool doubling that's going on. And then when I went to Bluetooth, it got to a much more amorphous sort of thing. So something's going on there, probably something that's going on with the phase that's trying to actually go and save a bunch of data. All right, after I passed my sighted test, I had my esteemed audiophile colleague come on and give me a blind test in which he went through and just was going A and B sort of thing, randomly picking one of the two and was asking me, which one are you listening to? That one was on The Poet and the Painter. I got 9 out of 10 correct. And the one that I got wrong, I said, no, wait, hold on, I'm not sure on that one. And he said, yeah, too late, you already locked in your answer. I think he had a vested interest in me messing it up. So after you do that, you record the samples. I'm using a Topping E2x2, the Topping DX5-2, feeding it by balanced connections, adjust the levels in REW to get the best signal to noise, record each segment 2 times in Audacity there, shift the tracks to roughly align them, export as 24-bit FLAC. This, by the way, is a sample as to what this test rig is looking like, which, as a quick aside, is actually better than the audio precision that my dad had in the late 1980s that we were testing everything on. Once you've done that, then you import it into DeltaWave, you let it do its thing. And the first thing you need to actually demonstrate is that, yes, in fact, we can actually have it do the null, that all of this works. It's called a negative control. This shouldn't show anything. And so this is then those 2 USB tracks up against each other. And so what we can see here is that we have the 2 USB tracks. It does all the matching, does all the alignment, and here's the difference in the waveforms, and there's nothing. So in the middle here is negative infinity. This first thing that comes up, this first line here is minus 40 dB. You'll see why I picked these levels here in just a bit. It'll also then say, all right, let's take a spectrum analysis of the difference to sort of say, where is it? What's the spectral content? Low frequencies all the way up to high frequencies. What's the spectral content of this? And you see that it's really just noise. This is down at almost 130 dB down. It's just a random hash. Okay. 2 things that shouldn't be different aren't different. Oh, one other quick thing on, so on this then, we can say, all right, let's do USB versus Bluetooth. So take the 2 recordings, sync them all up, do all that same kind of thing. And on the left here, I'm showing the USB versus USB. So that's the same graph that you just saw. And on the right is the USB minus the Bluetooth. And oh yeah, there's a whole bunch here. This is about minus 28 dB worth of a peak here. This is about 34 dB or something like this. You see there's a huge amount of signal that's coming through. I mean, okay, fine. Huge is a bit of an overstatement. But there certainly are things that are bopping into that range of, oh, wait a minute. Maybe you're actually going to be hearing this because it's 30 some odd dB down from the main signal. The spectrum analysis on the left here, again, this is around minus 130 dB or something like this. But then on the Bluetooth, we can see that there is a spectrum here. One of the things Bluetooth is also doing in this codec is cutting out the high end. But we can see that the differences here are in the 80 to 90 dB, kind of range. You can also see that there are changes in the phase. Again, the USB versus USB shows that there's nothing, but here we can see that what the Bluetooth codec in this case has done is it's shifted the phase. So this is 0 degrees worth of phase, and you can see in the high end here, we have a whole bunch that's actually going on with the phase. Remember what I said? I specifically picked a track in which I had this doubling that was going on, and that's a little trick played by phase to get it so that you're actually hearing those two different sources. Yeah, that's actually probably what I'm picking up. So one other last little bit about this tool is that it computes something it calls the PK metric. And if you ask what PK stands for, I'll remind you that the author's initials, okay, that's PK. In any case, it's his attempt to try to say what actually might be audible. So if we take these sources here and we say, okay, the USB minus USB 1, it's 104 dB down. Any difference? It's purely in the noise of my rig here. You're not hearing that. When we think about the loudest sound that you actually possibly can have down to the faintest, this kind of range is not something that you're going to hear, in particular when music is going on and we have masking. Actually, if you go back to that quote from the stereophile thing on my title slide, it was saying that you can get something like 0.15% distortion on a pure sine wave, or on some pairs of sine waves kind of thing. You can be very good, but as soon as music was going on, they were talking numbers like 10 to 20% distortion before a number of things were becoming audible. This, of course not. However, in this particular setup with Bluetooth, is that 61 dB down. Oh, okay. Maybe again, this is in the range. So I'm bringing it up here because this is the sort of thing that we can actually do with null tests. By the way, I showed you a little sample before as to what's going on with Airplay. Airplay can run in a lossless mode, or does typically run in a lossless mode there, 16-bit, 44.1, so you're talking standard Redbook CD kinds of specs here. And when we take a look at the spectrum of the difference here, you see that this is 120 dB and 130 dB. So again, very, very good in terms of the spectral content of the difference. There's very little going on. What is going on is really at the high end here. And honestly, it's probably having a little bit to do with some resampling that's happened. And when we look at that in that PK metric, you can see 90 dB or so worth on that. So it's doing quite well. All right, so if you've sat through all of this here, hopefully this conclusion can make some sense here. I want you to remember in all of this as we go forward, because I hope to do this with some other gear, is that the null test shows us what we might be able to hear. Just because it shows a difference doesn't mean that you can actually hear it though. However, if it doesn't show anything, so for example, if we take 2 amps or 2 DACs and put them together and they null out perfectly, well, if that happens and it nulls out perfectly, it means that you can't actually hear it. And that's what I hope to do in the rest of the series.